Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome Dr. Leslie Martin this morning. She's an assistant professor with the Department of Medicine. She's joining us today to give a talk on managing tensions in EPA-based assessment to optimize learning. She's a general internist at Hamilton Health Sciences. Her clinical focus is in addictions medicine. She's co-chair of inpatient addictions medicine services. She's finished a master's in health professions education through the Maastricht University in Netherlands. She's a merit scholar, and her primary research interest is medical education research involving exploring the impact of assessment on learning through qualitative methodology, which is very salient for EPA. So, welcome, Leslie.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I don't know, maybe like 25% of you in the room through training through internal medicine, people that have come through, but most of the staff and anesthetists, we don't cross paths unless there's a disaster. So anyways, nice to see you guys, and thanks for having me. I think it's great to present this to you guys because some of your own anesthesia residents participated in my data collection, and this was for my thesis, which was just published this month in medical education. So I appreciate the resident contribution to this work, and I hope it's meaningful to discuss with you guys because it is, some of the data that came out of this was from your own trainees. So I was asked by Sandra to come and talk to you about this, and these were some objectives that I thought would be of interest to you guys, and I have some data and quotes from my qualitative work to help frame this discussion. But I was hoping to really explore our current understanding of workplace-based learning as well as workplace-based assessment now that we're in the CBME context, and what tensions exist between using assessments for formative purposes, meaning for learning, versus summative purposes or for promotional decisions, and what challenges exist by kind of using those single assessment moments for two purposes. And then how can we look to balance some of those tensions to optimize learning at both at the individual and the programmatic level. So I think in general it's quite intuitive to all of us that workplace-based learning happens and that mostly doctors are learning through work, particularly at the postgraduate level. As stated by Osler, he who studies medicine without books sails an uncharted sea, but he who studies medicine without patients does not go to sea at all. So the majority of our training experiences are happening in the workplace, and that's quite intuitive. And there's many different models that capture that in the medical education literature, like the apprenticeship model, community of practice, and different models around workplace-based learning. So that in and of itself is not new. This paper is relatively new, and it's a nice summary of postgraduate medical education training and workplace-based learning. So it systematically excluded assessment, which I think is worth noting because there are some separate impacts on the learning environment from introducing frequent assessments. However, I thought this model is really nice, and if anyone is interested in this, I would direct you to this paper just published this year. So within the center, I hope it projects okay. I tried to blow it up as much as I could. In the center, you have the supervisor, you have the trainee, and then you have patients. And some of the interactions here they're really back and forth interactions. So you have feedback and meaning making. And the feedback, as many of you know, is really quite dependent on the delivery as well as the interaction between both the supervisor and the trainee. So the relationship is very important. It should not be just a one-way delivery of information, but more of a conversation, and that comes up in some of the new conversations around coaching in the workplace environment. And whether the trainee integrates that feedback is dependent on a number of different factors. So do they see that supervisor as credible? Do they think the timing with which it's delivered and the location with which it's delivered is reasonable? Did the person actually observe what they're providing feedback on, and that impacts whether they'll integrate it and then move it into their practice moving forward? Meaning making on the other side is the trainee's ability to kind of voice their clinical reasoning, which helps the supervisor understand where the trainee is coming from. So it's a really dialogue-based back and forth between the supervisor and the trainee. The next level is monitoring and modeling, which actually isn't always about dialogue and sometimes is much more just about observation. So monitoring is the supervisor's kind of supervision of their trainee, and some people are a little bit more micromanaging and others are more hands-off. But either way, that's the monitoring, and that comes into safety of practice as well, so psychological safety of your trainee, knowing that you're monitoring them or not, and how closely you do that can impact how much they grow. And that's where direct observation really does come into play as well. Modeling is sometimes affects the trainee's behavior because they might know what their supervisor wants and kind of gear their behavior based on their supervisor. But also that's kind of where the hidden curriculum falls in. So they're observing their supervisors, they're learning from their work environment, and they're integrating by modeling into that environment. And then the final piece there is participation. And so that speaks to entrustment and support seeking. And this isn't entrustable professional activities here. This is just, as a supervisor, I am going to trust this trainee to perform this task with or without my supervision. So much more outside the realm of assessment and more just in our day-to-day working environment. But it is from this concept that we developed the idea of entrustable professional activities. So I'll talk about that because it's quite intuitive to us. We do this every day. And then support seeking is those behaviors that our trainees do that help build our trust. So if they know that they've reached the end of their abilities and they call you and they say, I need your help, you trust them more because you recognize that they have insight into their own skill set. So that is also kind of a participation back and forth between the supervisor and the trainee. And then outside of that, you have your clinical tasks, which change in terms of complexity, and so obviously that impacts those back and forth relationships. You have the local culture and practice, which I'd say is very different even between disciplines. So between, my discipline of internal medicine, where we don't directly observe nearly as much, versus your discipline, where there's a lot more direct observation. So there's a lot to do with culture. And then the last part is just your clinical team, so those that you're working with. And around the outside of all of this is kind of the outcomes. So what happens with your trainees? Do they themselves become supervisors? Where do they choose to practice? How do they engage in lifelong learning? And all of those other outcomes that hopefully come out through all of the workplace-based learning experiences they had as a trainee. So I think this model is a really nice launching point to understand workplace-based learning outside of the realm of assessment. And then when we start to integrate more frequent assessments, what might we expect to come out from that? Although it's early days because we're quite early into the CBME transition. So how often were we directly observing trainees in the workplace-based learning environment before CBME? This literature comes from internal medicine, so it might have been different if they'd analyzed an anesthesia department. But this was back in 1990, and they interviewed around 6,000 internal medicine trainees. And they got back that residents felt they were observed conducting a history only once during their entire training, 45%. 64% of residents say they were observed once doing a physical exam during their full training. And 26 thought they could think of maybe 6 instances where they were observed. So this is, this environment where workplace-based learning is so important, where we think direct observation really feeds into the meaningful feedback that we can provide to our trainees, yet this is what we were doing in some disciplines, be it not all of them were captured in this one. And that really led to the next movement, which was maybe we should be doing more workplace-based assessments, because then we can really increase the frequency with which we are actually observing our trainees and perhaps documenting that. It was felt to be a powerful tool for formative assessment. And so much of the literature, including the paper I've quoted at the bottom, which is the AME Guide for Workplace-Based Assessment, was using this for formative purposes. And for those not familiar with the formative, summative language, by formative I mean for learning. So I'm going to observe you, maybe I'll write this down, but I'm not going to put this into your portfolio or into whatever you're using to gather your data. I'm just going to provide this to you to learn and grow from. And to create a feedback conversation. And there's many different, before the era of CBME, ways that this was being done. So the EPA is kind of taken over in Canada, but there's also multi-source feedback. There's the direct observation of procedural skills. There's your clinical encounter cards, many of which will be familiar with the MACDOT, because that's what our medical students at McMaster use. The Mini CX probably has the most literature behind it. So you might have seen some of these other tools. And when we wonder, why was the uptake of workplace-based assessment so low, there was a great paper that came out by Chris Watling, who works out at Western, who, did some qualitative work to really understand why are we not doing this more before we moved into CBME where it was mandated. And so this quote I thought was quite powerful. So there's just that sense, and it's really pervasive, that you should never want to go back to that place of being observed because you're relinquishing your independence and your autonomy. So there's a huge culture in medicine about efficiency and autonomy, and I think that for the most part goes into our hidden curriculum. It's not necessarily something that we're always pushing forward, but it is very pervasive throughout the culture, and perhaps that's why we weren't directly observing so much, because the residents didn't want to necessarily ask for it because being autonomous is so important. So now we move into our Royal College era of competence by design. And as part of that, we have framed entrustable professional activities, as you guys all know, for every single specialty. And these were meant to capture the core tasks of any profession, the main things you need to be able to do by the time you complete your training. And the reason this was framed around tasks is that people felt that tasks would be much more intuitive for the day-to-day provider. So for many years we've had the CanMEDS flower, the different competencies, and as I'm sure many of you saw or lived, there was a struggle to try to integrate the assessment of competencies into our day-to-day work. So how were we capturing professionalism? It often was added to our ITER forms, but we weren't sure we were capturing it in a meaningful way. But if we center that around a task, and then really tease out what particular competencies are required to perform that task, perhaps it becomes more intuitive to assess some of those competencies. And they developed, along with that, a scale of entrustment, as again you're all familiar with, although the anchors can be slightly different from program to program and institution to institution. But the idea being that we're now linking our numbers to a construct that is more intuitive for us. Trust, something we already were doing in our workplace-based learning environment, as I showed you on that last slide. So did I need to step in and take over for you, or did I really think I didn't need to be there? And so by linking the anchors to something that's more familiar, perhaps we can create more reliable and robust assessments, rather than just saying you did that excellently, or you did that in an unsatisfactory way, shall we say. So this is kind of the place that we are now. However, I do want to highlight that EPAs are not programmatic assessment. And again, I'm not sure that's a term you're familiar with, but another movement in the literature is this idea of creating entire programs of assessment to almost create a 360 picture of our trainees. And EPAs themselves are just one piece. And every individual assessment tool has shortcomings. As I'm sure many of you guys are familiar with, you sit down and you write a multiple choice test, and it covers a broad, vast array of different topics, but really doesn't dive deep into them. It doesn't really assess your procedural skills, etc. Whereas you might do a simulation, which assesses one specific procedure, but doesn't capture all the different procedures you need to be able to do. So there's shortcomings to every test. And the same is true for the assessments of EPAs or any workplace-based assessment. So it is important to keep in mind that this is one piece, and that any programmatic assessment should be, ideally, where the total is more than the sum of the parts itself. And the idea here in programmatic assessment and in our current EPA transition is that each individual assessment is supposed to be low stakes. And so because it's low stakes, we can provide meaningful feedback and can be formative. You can feel psychologically safe to participate in that, not feel like you're being analyzed or criticized. And at the beginning, it might just look like random pop bottles or random little dots. But the idea is that over time, you can aggregate those to form a more meaningful picture. And that can form your high stakes decisions. That assumes that at this early stage here, everybody feels safe to learn and engage, and that they don't feel like this summative decision is going to be based on every single assessment moment. But we know that assessment drives learning. That's very well documented in the literature. If you're going to study to your test. And so how does that play out in your day-to-day work environment over 5 years where you're being assessed all the time, yet in the past we know that you're going to study for your test. So how does that interplay? And that's really what led me to the study that I conducted for my master's thesis, to explore the impact of entrustment assessments on feedback and learning from the perspective of trainees. And I did this alongside some colleagues locally, as well as my master's thesis supervisor in the Netherlands at Maastricht. So we had rolled out, at the time, this was a few years back, only in a small number of programs using competency-based assessment tools. So anesthesia, general internal medicine, nephrology, the subspecialty training programs, and then emergency medicine. And all of the programs at the time had been using the entrustment tools for about 7 to 8 months. We did focus groups, and we had the focus groups based in specialties so that everybody could kind of comfortably share with one another and have shared experience, because the culture is different from program to program. And the data analysis was guided by constructivist grounded theory, which basically means that we interpret the data from the ground up, and that we recognize that the interactions of the participants really kind of affects the interpretation, as does the perspective of those analyzing the data. So I was part of the analysis. I'm a general internist with a master's in health professions. Daniel Brandt Vegas is also a general internist with a master's in health professions education, and Matthew Sebald is a cardiologist with a PhD. And the three of us did the data analysis and Marianne Gover is an educationalist in the Netherlands and participated in that. Just so you know where we're coming from, because actually who we are matters in our interpretation. So what did we find? What we found was that there's some pretty profound tensions that come out when we're using EPAs and entrustment scales to guide learning and feedback for our trainees. On one side, we have this idea of assessment for learning, as I discussed, and on the other side, we have the idea of assessment of learning. So the first is kind of the perceived framework. So it's important that what you're defining with your EPAs are flexible enough to capture people's day-to-day work experiences, that it feels authentic, that you're capturing something that they're actually doing, so they're not just fitting a square peg into a round hole. But at the same time, they did feel like it was helpful to guide important things that they needed to become good at by the time they finished their training and to map their own kind of experiences towards. So it needed to be specific enough that it guided them in some way, but flexible enough that it still felt authentic for their day-to-day experiences. Next was kind of the perceived goal. So am I doing this for learning, or am I doing this for performance and for promotion? And that was a constant kind of tug and pull. Most of the individuals I spoke to said, I realize that it's super important for me to be observed and for me to learn, but at the same time I need to pass, and I want to make sure that I get promoted through my training program. And that was a real push-pull. And then the last part is the balance between words and numbers. So trainees, and I'll show you some quotes to kind of emphasize this, but trainees felt very strongly that the words were more meaningful, be it narrative, what was written down, or verbal, what was spoken to them. But they also felt a great deal of stress around the numbers. And I think that feeds back to, am I going to pass? Did I meet the performance expectations that I needed to? And so the numbers caused more stress, but the words were more meaningful. So these are just some quotes to kind of highlight that. And then I only planned to speak for about half an hour because I thought there was going to be an introduction and a departmental review piece before this. So hopefully you guys have some comments about experiences that have happened since, and we can kind of chat about that, and then I'll wrap up. But the first point I have is around the flexibility. So I think if they put too much focus on us having to hit all these EPAs while off service, we'll miss a lot of the non-specialty specific training that we should be getting while off service to have a good general understanding of different specialties. So there's this idea that there's value beyond what's captured by the EPAs, and that even if it's just about understanding the culture of that other specialty, meeting people in that other specialty, or performing the day-to-day activities of that other specialty, it was still meaningful even though it wasn't captured by the EPAs. And then the standardization was, it gives us a goal. We need to be able to do this by the end of our training independently. I need to try to see as much as I can of it, get as many assessments, and get comfortable with it, because this is really core to my profession. For the goal, I felt like the EPA evaluations that I've done so far, at least it kind of makes people hone in or focus on a specific task. They're almost directed to give you more constructive and relevant feedback. So sometimes at the end of the day, students will get, good job, you did great. And then, you could use this EPA to say, well, what about this? Can you give me some feedback on this specific task? And then suddenly it opens a conversation and you can get very directed, relevant feedback. However, at the same time, I can predict it. I would probably do it too. I would cherry pick the good experience. Remember that one patient where I did everything right? Can you fill out my EPA on that so that that captures my good performance? Which is probably the case you need the least feedback on. And then there's this dichotomy between the words and the numbers, which I think was kind of the most interesting piece that came out of this. So I think the verbal feedback and the trust that the staff puts into me is way more important, but I stress out about the numbers more. The numbers have a direct bearing on whether or not I completed a task in a satisfactory way for my program. And this was also emphasized if there was discrepancy between the word and the numbers. So if you told me I did everything well, but you gave me, I had to take over, or if you told me I didn't need to be there, but yet you gave me all sorts of constructive criticism. Like if they didn't align, it was very confusing, and they cared more about the words, but then it's quite confusing if the number doesn't align with the words. And then from the numbers, I have a hard time seeing this as anything different than a numbering scale. On one end it's good, on the other end it's bad, and that's kind of all it means to me. It doesn't matter that the anchors are there with the trust. And just expanding a little further on this, it can color the entire experience of a trainee's day. So sometimes there are days where if I missed an EPA, I felt, oh man, that was a waste of a day. But it was a good day. But on paper, it was a waste of a day because I didn't pass my EPA. And you know, for some people, that's why they felt it was still very important to have opportunities for more global assessment moments rather than always very specific around a task. So kind of in summary for this, I think one of the big outcomes is that the design of EPAs is very important. And if you're too broad, you can't guide your goal setting. And if you're too narrow, you might ignore or undervalue other experiences and you become at risk to develop a tick box exercise where people are just going to try to get their work done and perform in the way that they need to in order to move forward in their training. But also there's this desire for success and anxiety and frustration if you're not deemed competent. We're all high achievers. I don't think this is a surprise to anybody. But it can impact people's motivation. It can impact their stress. And it does suggest to me that individuals are still viewing these low stakes assessment moments as summative or contributing to their overall progression. So psychological safety is very important. We know that from feedback-seeking behaviors in workplace-based learning, even before we integrated into an assessment-heavy day-to-day workflow. And that's still going to be very important as we move into a workflow that uses more frequent daily assessments. So before I kind of jump into my conclusions, I just wanted to see if this reflects some of your own experiences so far using your tools. You guys are now 3 years, you're in your 3rd year. And so does this still resonate with you? Does anyone have any thoughts? Yeah.
Thank you for coming, first of all.
Yeah.
I'm the chair of our competency committee. This information resonates very well with what we're seeing, I think, at our competency committee level. I find it interesting the words versus numbers conversation. And how do you know, I can see the impact that residents have with respect to not being successful on our GPA and just looking at the number versus the conversation that happens. That's very important coaching aspect. But at the competency committee level, how do we get, this may be a question for later on.
Yeah.
How do we get beyond the numbers and look at those words with respect to making the words more important than just the number?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I'll reflect that in kind of my summary thoughts as well. I do think we need to be de-emphasizing the numbers for a few reasons. We're still developing our faculty to really understand what these numbers mean. And so I think there is still a learning curve happening where unintentionally our faculty are ascribing a number that really doesn't capture what they meant. Because I still think there's the residual, you know, you're a PGY whatever, and you shouldn't be able to do this independently at whatever stage, even though that our tasks were written along a stage of training, and technically if you're in foundations and you're at the end of PGY 1, that is the level that you're supposed to be at. I still think there's that learning curve happening across all of PGME. So I think that will get better, but I'm not sure it will ever be solved entirely. And I think the numbers also work to trivialize the conversation because there's much more nuance to how well somebody performs a task, whether you would give them feedback or not, and even if you've given them feedback, whether that means that they could have done it without you, because all of us have kind of different opinions on how things should be done, and that doesn't necessarily mean that one is right and the right way to do it and should be done independently in that way, and the other is wrong and you shouldn't be able to do it independently. So I think the beauty of medicine is that there's so much spectrum to how we all approach things, and I think we miss that in this because I like to do it this way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your way is wrong, but that could color how I provide my feedback. So I think de-emphasizing the scale would be reasonable and really reading into the comments and inferring from the comments the degree of independence, but that takes a lot more work and requires a great deal to be written down. And I'm not sure that that's going to happen either. In some institutions, they've done some studies where they do feedback conversations and somebody else is hired as a research assistant to write down the narrative feedback, and then they use that narrative feedback to guide their decision making at their competence committee level. That's also not very realistic, right? We're not going to have scribes running around documenting all your guys' feedback, but I think that captures the idea that there's so much more to the conversation that doesn't end up coming to the competence committee and really is probably where the truth lies. So as a competence committee, I think it's okay to, if there's discrepancy between the number and the words, to make a decision to say, I trust the words. And despite the fact that this number doesn't really reflect it, maybe I don't think that this one maybe they've passed this EPA, you know, even though they didn't meet the numbers. So reducing that granularity of we need to have 5 EPAs in these 3 situations at this particular numeric score in order to move forward, which I think a lot of competence committees are doing, but it takes time and practice to go through. And probably eventually will help the residents feel less stressed about each individual assessment moment if they know that's happening at the back level. Does that answer your question? No, yeah.
I think one of the tensions on the assessor side is, especially in anesthesia when you're working with someone for 8, 10 hours,
yeah.
and they're working hard to have a good day, and then you have an opportunity to assess the EPA, you have the tension in you that you don't want to give them bad feedback.
Yes.
Even if there's a real issue to discuss. Yet, as a coach, as a thing, if you don't give them honest, constructive feedback, you feel like you're not doing your job, and then you've missed a learning opportunity.
Yeah.
I'd be curious of what strategies there would be to deliver that message when someone doesn't pass an EPA, so they don't take it as a total failure for a day. Is there any strategies for the assessors so they can soften the blow and get the most out of a learning opportunity?
Yeah, as one future stage to my study, I actually want to start interviewing faculty as well, just to see that opinion, because I know that's shared, and I have internal medicine colleagues that feel the same way. They don't want to do anything that's going to harm the self-efficacy of their trainees. Like, we're all here because we actually want to help promote them, and sometimes it can be very hard to feel like you're giving them a 2 or a 3, even from the faculty end, and then it can be hard to receive. I mean, I'll answer, and then maybe we can open up to see if the trainees have any ideas. I think one thing would be if you have the time to fill both because you guys still have your global assessments, to maybe fill a global and an EPA, or to choose maybe 2 EPAs and do the one that's quite constructive, but then captures in some other way all the other positive things that they've done for the day, might be an idea. Because I know the trainees brought up in the focus groups, they feel very guilty asking for more than one assessment, so they feel like they have to choose one, and that's pervasive through all of them. Like, the trainees don't want to burden their faculty with the number of assessments that need to be filled, came forward in all of the interviews. So that's maybe one idea, because I do think you're right. Or maybe you choose, if it's not critical, to not necessarily fill the EP on that one particular incident, but to provide verbal feedback around that incident and fill out a different assessment if that's what you wanted to do for that day. I think at the end of the day, if we're doing this more often, then they truly will start to feel more low stakes because there's more and more opportunities to obtain them. So I think there's a bunch of different ways that it could be approached, but I absolutely appreciate what you were saying, and it feels different to provide that verbal feedback than to document it and send it to the competence committee. I think everybody kind of realizes that as a faculty and as a trainee. And that's the real change that's happened with CBME, is now we're writing it all down. I think we did this for a long time. You guys definitely did, because there's a lot of direct observation in anesthesia. But now we're writing it down and it feels different. Do any trainees have any thoughts? Sorry. Yeah.
And just to add to this idea, I think that's what makes the global daily such an important component at the end of the day. Because you may have a bad moment in the day where you don't pass the EPA, or you feel like it didn't go as well.
Yeah.
And that's why the global daily is there to kind of be like, you know, the day went well.
Yeah.
And that's where sometimes if you do multiple evaluations in one day, find sometimes that the global daily gets left behind.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of quality of feedback, you've already received very specific feedback at one point, and it becomes an afterthought. Where in my mind, it's almost like the global daily should always be more important in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Because the EPAs are just snapshots.
Yeah. Yeah, I think and not even just in anesthesia where you guys get a lot of direct observation, but from many different faculty, even in general internal medicine where people were working with faculty members, 2 weeks straight, they valued the ITER a great deal. because that global assessment of how did you do over 2 weeks was very important to trainees beyond the EPAs that might have been done once a day, or in medicine probably less often than once a day. So I do think maintaining some degree of a global, and I think that feeds back again to this idea of a program of assessment, where one assessment strategy doesn't really meet the needs of the whole program or of the trainee in isolation. But we also have to balance time as well.
One of the things I've gotten back from the residents is a tremendous production pressure. It's an awful lot of EPAs.
Yes.
Almost more EPAs than there are days in the program altogether. And that almost sort of detracts. It's sort of quality versus quantity.
Yes.
Do you have any sort of thoughts about how to sort of fit that in so it's objective? It's not just this, but the day's all about EPAs.
Yes.
The entire rotation isn't about just getting those numbers, and the
Yeah.
training becomes diluted with this sort of almost numerical obsessiveness.
Yes.
And it's easy all to sort of do with of OCD, and then you lose the focus of the training altogether.
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas about that? Or any insight?
So I think that comes back to the risk of it becoming a tick box exercise, where if you just feel like you have to meet that many, and that actually weighs into the stress of getting a 5 or whatever number is deemed competent on each of them, because if you have to do so many already and you have to meet a certain cutoff, then you feel like anytime you don't get a passing score, oh shoot, because now I'm just behind the 8 ball on these 1,000 assessments that I have to achieve anyways. So that's where I think the granularity comes in. Like, how many do you guys have now? You used to have 70 or so. You stepped down on your EPA number, right? Okay. You're still, I think, one of the highest programs in terms of numbers of EPAs, which is fine, I think, but the granular expectation that you must achieve this many by this certain date, I think, is where that stress comes in. And so if there's ways where programs can build a little more flexibility into those granular expectations, and it is difficult because a lot of this was Royal College mandated, but we are able to create flexibility in our interpretations of our data. So finding ways to try to create more flexibility on the competence committee end so that people don't feel like they have to hit all the check boxes at all the numbers in all the scenarios to pass might help quell some of that stress. Yes.
Thanks for giving comprehensive review of EPAs. But the question is, we talk about low stakes assessments.
Yeah.
As soon as we document it, it invariably is perceived as high stakes.
Yes.
Is there any value just getting rid of it completely and just having a verbal conversation like we used to do, and focus on the learning aspect of it and the teaching component of it without the documentation? I mean, I can understand the idea of EPAs, you want to see the progress of the individual, but my experience in the last 3 years of this whole thing is as soon as you start adding a number or any narrative comment on it, it's perceived as a high stakes exam. Us being high achievers generally, it creates a lot of stress and tension, and the learning component, in my view, gets lost because it does become invariably viewed as a scientific assessment.
Yeah.
So why don't we just get rid of that whole, just look at the end point, like
Yeah.
you do with exams and tests at the end of 5 years or whatever, and just view the 5 assessments we need to get to pass and leave it at that, instead of trying to look at this progress, because we're not seeing that. We're seeing 0 to 100. We're not seeing any data points.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few reasons for that. First of all, we designed the Royal College designed their EPAs along a competence continuum. So this idea that you're going to see people move through that competence continuum from a 1 to a 2 to a 3 to a 4 to 5 is not real when you've written the EPAs already along a continuum. So I think in the States, the way they've done it is they have kind of all their competencies set out for the end of training, and you do see trainees move through that progression of competence because it's the same final task that they're working towards. And in PGY1, they're not doing it independently, yet in PGY2 they're closer, and in PGY3 they're there, and then in PGY they actually never quite get there, but they get to somewhere like here, generally speaking. We're never going to see that with our system design, because you start out with a transition to discipline EPA, which is a very medical school level EPA, and you should be able to get a 5 at the beginning. And then by the time you move to your foundations, you're probably already at a level where you're going to be getting 4s and 5s. So part of it's in the design. I don't think that there's anything wrong with that design, but you're not going to see those numbers necessarily moving up, except for some particular, like in medicine, the procedures are only in our core, and so we start evaluating them right away, and there we can see some progression. So that's just a bit of a design piece. I don't think it's a flaw, but it's a piece, and it's why we're not seeing that progression of competence. I think it'd be a shame to entirely get rid of this idea of ensuring our trainees are getting frequent feedback on the most important things for their career in any given profession. I don't think that that's a bad thing. I do think, well, as I showed you, that then you don't necessarily do it. So beforehand, when we had the opportunity for workplace-based assessments, but they were not mandatory, people weren't doing them. So, on balance, I think it is a good thing to be able to ensure we're actually providing feedback on the most important things. And we couldn't ensure that before. And it's providing a lot more meaningful feedback to competence committees. Like, I think the amount that we know about our trainees is much more now than it used to be when we sit around the table and review their files and review their progress. So I think there is value to ensuring some degree of what we're doing is being documented, even from a public accountability perspective, but also from us monitoring our trainees at greater frequency of intervals and with more data. However, I think if we don't create the right culture and the right psychological safety and the right flexibility, then that's when we get into trouble of all the stress and feeling like everything in and of itself is high stakes. So I think if we just work on the culture and work on the narrative and work on the fact that maybe we don't need to be focusing so much on getting 4s and 5s and hitting the exact number of everything that's been transcribed by a Royal College, then we can lower the pressure and then, be learning a little bit more through these exercises. That would be my thought on it. I do think getting rid of it entirely would be a shame, because I do think that there has been a substantial increase in the provision of feedback and the frequency of direct observation. Absolutely, in my field, there's been a big change.
Just in response to your comment, if you got rid of the documentation and there was an issue with the program, how would the program know? Because the issue of the assessment is to identify someone who needs some help. And then if you got rid of that and the program centrally wouldn't necessarily know there was an issue until much later on, like it used to be.
It seems to be placed more emphasis on the global dailies than on the EPAs. That's where we are at. So we will always keep the global dailies because it's a more comprehensive evaluation of that data.
I would actually almost say the opposite from a council committee perspective. Our problem with the council committee, with the learning process, is that it's bean counting everything. Right? It's looking at how many independently successful EPAs individuals have done, and placing more importance on that than the comments, which I absolutely embrace what you're saying. It's getting over those numbers and just forgetting about it, but still having a document.
Or at least exploring them. So I think, like, if you're seeing 2s and 3s, but you should be diving into those comments and saying, is this truly a 2 and 3? Is there a flag here in my resident's performance? Because it is a lot more specific, and that is helpful. Whereas the global daily, probably for them, I haven't read your global dailies, but I have to fathom it's not specific to a trainee's ability to perform any one of the tasks that they did through the day. It's probably much more broad strokes than that. And so you take those and you say, okay, the trainee looks okay, but I don't know anything specific about how they're actually doing in the OR from a day-to-day perspective. Whereas you do get that from the EPAs. But I think it comes down to really looking at the narrative and being a little more flexible about the bean counting, because if it's all about bean counting, the trainees will know that they're going to be stressed about making sure they have all their numbers met, and you're just going to be kind of going through, and going through numbers is the fastest way to do it, but it's not necessarily most meaningful.
If I can just add,
Yeah.
that, as a non-clinician, but having an understanding of assessment in different contexts, a lot of drivers for this new system are very context specific, and so I find that different specialties are confused about certain things because it's not their personal
Yeah.
challenge. So even going back to your earlier slides around, 45% of residents reported that they've had only one observation.
It's not from anesthesia.
It's not going to be from anesthesia. But even in that context, I hear faculty talking about, well, that's because what they don't know is I'm in the background looking at their charting and talking to the staff and going to follow up with the patient. And so checking on them indirectly in ways that the trainee doesn't realize. Other things that we find out is there's actually, so this tension that you talk about is, it's replicated when you do studies that ask residents about coaching and feedback, is all the residents will sort of, that's kind of a blanket statement in that I don't get enough feedback.
Yeah.
I don't get enough coaching. And the faculty are like, what are you talking about? I'm always giving them, something and advice, what to read on or what to do better. And personally, it may be this issue of demystifying what's going on, and maybe if it's not documented, the trainees don't necessarily remember that something specific happened on any given day, or that a bunch of different feedback was given, over a week, because it's just all ends up being a blur. So if there aren't maybe these triggers, whether they're on paper or on your phone or whatever, in terms of having to document an EPA, maybe the trainee doesn't have something to say, oh yeah, that faculty took that time and told me something important, and then they can retrieve that.
Yeah.
So we're hoping that, what the trainees experience and remember about their residency program at the end of the day is different because of the bean counting. I kind of see the bean counting as your program evaluation data, which at the end of, every 5 years you can look back and say, this is how well we've tracked everyone. We had an eye on every single person, and we know that they were able to do this. I've observed different competency committees and how they, what kind of data they review and how they review that data. And sometimes it's also about, okay, what's the curriculum we're going to develop now? Because here's an entire column of EPAs that are not getting checked because it's not there for the trainees. It's not an opportunity for them to experience. And so then programs are creating those opportunities. I think it's, that's what I think is great about having this presentation, and Leslie sharing her data from those different specialties and having the conversations is making those perceptions and the intentions kind of clear. And the drivers for emergency medicine and internal medicine in terms of having those documentations are going to be different for anesthesia, and so it might feel weird, but
Yeah, I mean, it definitely came forward in my interviews as well, that not only about the documentation, but having that protected moment where you sit down and you talk about the performance on a specific task it puts that memory in their mind of having had some directed feedback. So maybe you're giving feedback as they're actually, inserting the LMA or doing whatever they're doing, and you're giving that feedback, but they don't necessarily think of it as feedback, but sitting down and talking about it after the fact in a protected, quiet space, like the time and the location of feedback is actually very important for the trainee to integrate it. So that was brought forward by trainees and actually is reflected in the workplace-based learning literature as well.
Thanks, Leslie. It was a really great presentation on sort of the tensions that are, but I think it also highlights unintended consequences for theory, which was dreamed up from top down. Really, this is the way it's supposed to work, i.e., each small little biopsy, those things. In practice, it didn't end up that way. And I'm just wondering if, now you're probably not in a position to know, but I think we have an opportunity, having been through it after 3 years in other programs, what can we learn from, how can we mitigate these tensions, right? To find a middle ground or some way that we can actually further the actual goals of the assessment. So that's one comment. And the other thing I wanted to ask you is, in your interviews, residents also express the idea of constant surveillance and performance fatigue. So it takes away from, they're always feeling like they're under the microscope, they have to perform as opposed to learning.
Yeah.
They express that sense and the stress that comes with all the skills that they're performing as opposed to learning.
Yeah, so that was one of the tensions, was the learning versus performing. It didn't come forward that they were feeling necessarily constantly under the microscope for everything, because they weren't getting assessed on everything. They were getting assessed on one of all the things. And probably in some ways it would mitigate the stress if they had a good day and they were assessed on everything, because it would really capture the spectrum, like this is what you're good at and this is what you're not good at. But instead, all the weight is put on one single selected assessment moment. So I absolutely think that that's important, like the psychological safety to not feel constantly under assessment. But I didn't get that impression that they did feel constantly under assessment. Rather, it was the opposite. They felt that that one moment they chose had a huge amount of weight, because they were, especially in anesthesia, you're being observed the whole day, but you're only choosing one thing. Whereas in internal medicine, I'd say it's a little bit different. You're not observed, and then you're observed for one thing, and there's pressure on that one thing. Kind of in parallel, like a similar thing, there's pressure on that moment, but in a different context, shall we say. Yeah. Yeah.
As far as choosing that specific moment, I'm curious in some of the other specialties, so medicine, for example.
Yeah.
Can trainees, at the end of the week with their staff, or at the end of the day, can they say, we do some EPAs on these things?
Yeah.
That's what we do in ICU.
Yeah, they do.
Anesthesia, I think they have to say, all right, this is the arterial line that's going to be my EPA.
Yeah.
I wonder if that makes it, that it probably makes it more stressful. I imagine if you're deciding ahead of time that you're going to do something. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think just looking at the end of the day or sitting down a few times during the week, I think that would make it a little bit lower stress. I know there's a risk of cherry picking, but
Yeah.
if someone does something well 100 times, then
That on paper, that's supposed to be something the trainee looks forward to, right?
Yeah.
Great, I'm going to have constructive feedback as I do this thing live with the patient. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's how I.
Yeah, well, I think again that speaks to kind of the two tensions there. Am I going to pick something for performance, or am I going to pick something for learning? So if you're picking at the end of the day, you can pick for either, and it's kind of up to the trainee. Now, in theory, all of us can activate. Like I can also choose in internal medicine to say, I think we should do an EPA on this. Let's talk about it. But I'm not going to choose the most punitive thing either necessarily, right? So that also brings in the faculty's kind of role in deciding what they're going to document on paper as well. So it's both ways.
Just along the same lines, are all of your EPAs in internal medicine prospectively identified, or do you retrospectively go back and say, well, let's do an EPA on?
Either, both are allowed. Yeah.
So I think that's one of our learning points as well, is that there's a lot of, we do a lot of direct observation, but there's also a lot of indirect things that the residents do.
Yeah.
That can now be assessed through EPAs that we're not capturing.
Yes, many of the EPAs, and I'm not as familiar with yours, but many of them have the option to assess a certain percentage of them through indirect means, which obviously is, we do that all the time anyways. Like somebody goes and they see the pre-op consult and you can tell their clinical reasoning based on what they present back to you and what their plan is. We're constantly kind of making assessments on our trainees, even from those opportunities, and those can be captured in EPAs as well.
Point of view, you reassure the residents that it really is low stakes assessment EPAs, and when you're evaluating their portfolio, it really doesn't matter if they've tried and failed the EPA, as long as by the end of the stage of training that they've achieved it.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. We have had situations where, for instance, in foundations, there's specific EPAs with specific age populations. So, for instance, if you've haven't been at McMaster for a while, haven't seen children, and you're at your end of your foundations phase, you're still going to progress and go on. It doesn't mean you're going to be called back based on the fact that you haven't done certain EPAs. You're still going to continue on and progress, and it gives us the opportunity to come back and visit some of those EPAs later if need be. But one of the things I think we're learning is trying to get away from the bean counting, look at the more, the description of the encounters and where that lies, and incorporating a lot of the global daily comments into the EPAs, which that takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
But I think we are the best specialty set up for this conversation to take place with our trainers, right?
Yeah. I think the culture shift is a lot less here than it has been in many other learning environments.
and from what I've seen in different contexts, I do see situations where, a trainee may have attempted and let's call it the EPA several times. But there's knowledge, there's history, there's multiple faculty in the room that attest to the fact that that's not representative, right? And in fact, that's just what's on paper, sort of thing, or in the computer. But there's been growth, and then they talk about everything else. And so the decision is made that person's ready to move forward. So that definitely happens, and the system allows for that to happen. I guess the faculty are all for making that happen.
So maybe for sake of time, we'll take one more comment. I don't want to make you guys late to your ORs. Yeah, go ahead.
Still getting the feedback, and you recognize that I should be within, and in capturing 30 or 40 moments, I probably will have at least the return.
I think.
Took away the requirement that I have that 20 achievements.
Yeah.
Then as a creating, I feel like I would feel less like the day's wasted.
Yeah. I mean, what I'd say to that is that it's really so if you're getting are you guys using 5 as your cutoff for independence?
So we have a 4-point scale.
Oh, you have a 4-point scale.
We didn't like what the Royal College did.
Yeah.
So we made our own.
Yeah.
We're still going with that now because we're not authentic.
Yeah, you're using the Google Forms, right? Yeah.
So we have a 4-point scale. Independence
It's the 4th. Because I mean, for us, what we have done is we look through the narrative. So I'm also on the Internal Medicine Comments Committee. We look through the narrative comments and kind of say, okay, they didn't get 20 green because they didn't get 20 of number 4 or 20 of number 5 or whatever. But the other ones that they got seem to be very reasonable. They were earlier on in their training. They've hit the trajectory and they're short too. No problem. So I think there is flexibility to make those decisions in your competence committee level, but I don't know that you have to reset the granular expectations because that's also a lot of work. Like if you're just reprogramming everything to meet that end, I'm not sure that's necessary, but I do think it's reasonable to have flexibility to say the trajectory is right, the comments are good, I don't have concerns, they're missing just a few, that's okay. I mean, that's a decision your competence committee can make, but I think many competence committees are realizing that the granular expectations really is not what this process should be about. If that makes sense.
College come back to us every training program and say that. That's my problem right now.
Yeah.
Is that they've given us this mandate, right?
Yeah.
And as a program, as a competence committee, how can we not say what the Royal College is telling us?
Yeah.
Even though they've given us the flexibility, they say these are only
Guidelines.
recommendation
Yeah.
and guidelines. Like that's where we need to come to a balance here, right? Like that's one of the
And if it makes you feel better, other programs are doing it too. So Queen's was our first internal medicine colleagues that went live. I'm sure they went early for every program, even anesthesia. And they've absolutely been doing this since the very beginning. Like everybody kind of realizes once you get going that it's very difficult to make 100% lines. It's not the most rational, I think, from a day-to-day practical perspective. So just for time, I think it looks more like this. And that's okay. But I think, I don't want to lose the value of having the frequent assessments and feedback moments, capturing that, looking at that data, having a lot more robust information about how you guys are doing. And so my recommendations, really, we've talked about all of these, is just reducing that granularity, building in more flexibility, focusing more on the narratives, less on the numbers, promoting really meaningful aggregation at the competence committee level, but also with your coaches when you're reflecting over your data so it becomes more meaningful, including non-EPA assessments so that the entire conversation isn't always about EPAs, which you guys are doing with your globals, but other programs necessarily don't have built in. And I am hoping to continue this conversation by, first I'm reviewing all the literature that intersects learning and assessment, and then I'm hoping to move forward with more interviews locally, so hopefully I can integrate some of you guys, both faculty and resident level. And I do think, all in all, EPAs and entrustment scores can support assessment for learning. However, they can also intensify that tension between assessment for or assessment of learning. And we really have to make intentional efforts to balance those tensions so that our trainees have value from all of this. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for your conversation and contribution. I appreciate it.